DSM and the group for bringing me here. It's really, it's been wonderful. I've been in Spain many times, never been to Valencia, so I'm really, can't say I'm enjoying myself. You know, air pollution, as you will hear from my colleague, Dr. Clarity, it's very complicated. It's a very complex mixture of different things. And what I wanted to give you is just a very brief, if anything, just a very, very brief picture of some of the health effects. But instead of going through different compounds and what they necessarily would relate to, I selected a number of studies that will sort of capture a lot of the new developments that are happening on the field of air pollution. And hopefully you will have some questions. But in terms of, you know, in nutrition, I'm not a nutritionist, but in the nutrition world, a very well-known phrase is, you are what you eat, right? But you could certainly say that in the world of respiratory health, it's like you are what you breathe. And so if you're eating bad and you're breathing bad, it would be a bad thing to be, right? So, let me see, that changed the, oh, okay. So I'm just going to go very briefly. The United States Protection Agency, or the EPA, monitors different compounds that are called criteria air pollutants. And these are sort of that I think are monitored on a daily basis and on an annual basis. And some of them, for example, like lead, which sort of disappeared in the late 70s, early 80s, when it was taken off gasoline, used to be also very frequently monitored. Of course, lead exposure comes from other sites and not necessarily air. But there's certainly ozone, which is a secondary pollutant that's formed through the action of ultraviolet rays on nitric oxide. So big summer pollutant. Particulate matter is the one that I'm going to talk today about because it's a really interesting pollutant. It has very small particles that I will talk more about that. Sulfur dioxide is primarily emitted through fuel combustion and from electrical utilities and industries. Carbon dioxide, as you know, big greenhouse problem. And nitrogen dioxide, which is a sort of a marker of traffic. So those are sort of your big pollutants. And there are many other species that if you want, you can ask Jane, who actually does this for a living, unlike me. You know, I grew up in Mexico City, and whenever we were able to see the volcanoes, everybody talked about it. Because you probably couldn't see them, but maybe 1 or 2 days a week. Because they were always behind that thick pile of smog. And really what started the field of air pollution was a big, in 1954, 1952, the big London smog where people literally just dropped dead. And there were a lot of thousands of excess cardiovascular and respiratory mortalities. Where I live now in Pittsburgh, there was also an earlier smog event in the late 40s. And they're both sort of, this is London and this is Pittsburgh. And when you talk to people that live there, they said that it wasn't uncommon that at noon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the lights would come on as if it were the night because it was so dense, there was so much smog. And people went home and they worked and they came back and they had to change their shirts completely because they were full of soot. And so fortunately, we've come a long way. But one of the messages that I want to talk to you today is that in a beautiful day like Valencia right now, there could be air pollution that could threaten your health. You know, you don't need to have that level of smog to be impacted by air pollution at some different level. So I was fortunate to work with many wonderful colleagues in Mexico trying to capture some particles. And some of them that I was focusing on is fine particulate matter. So this is a filter, like the filters that Jane uses on her studies to capture pollutants. So they're like vacuum pumps and they force the air through a filter and they retain particles based on their size and other characteristics. So you can see all the pores, and you can see there's certainly this really ugly looking thing. It's a fossil combustion, and they can be very fine in the micron range. And what's interesting about these particles is they have a lot of huge surface area, so they can actually take a lot of bad guys on the ride, like metals and other toxic compounds. And this is one that comes from a coal combustion plant. So in a filter, there can be a lot of different species, and although that's not what we do, there are a lot of bacterial endotoxins in some of these compounds as well that can have different impacts in the immune system. To give you a point of reference, this is a hair, this is a pin, this is a pollen, red blood cell, bacteria, a virus, and molecules. So PM10, it's called thoracic particles, encompasses all of these, but mostly the PM10 talks about particles this is called particulate matter of an aerodynamic diameter of 10 microns or less, and you see a lot of dust. There's a lot of geological components in there, a lot of dust dispersion. PM2.5, or fine particulate matter, is the one that we're going to be focusing a lot, because that one is emitted through anthropomorphic sources like vehicle, exhaust, for example. And PM2.5, one of the things that happens is your body has tremendous amount of defense mechanisms to try to get rid of these guys. For example, when you breathe pollen or large particles, they actually get stuck in your nose. The nose is a fantastic place to really trap a lot of these particles. And then you blow your nose, and then that's it. But some of these guys actually bypass many of these things, especially if you're breathing with your mouth open, and they go right into the lung. They become fully saturated with vapor water, and they get deposited in the alveolar epithelium. And once they get deposited in the alveolar epithelium, from there they can cause inflammation, and they can go directly into the bloodstream and cause damage. So, and then there's ultrafine particles. So one of the things that you will see today is that it is not the same if you're waiting for a bus and raising your hand, and suddenly a bus walks by and there's a big, huge gulp of fresh emitted diesel, versus you're a few blocks away and are just breathing background pollution. These are very different mixtures. The ones that you get right at the side of the road are very fine and very, very fine particles that are going to penetrate all the way into your heart and in your brain, believe it or not. So one of the things about air pollution and risk is that the relationship is linear. That means that we see events happening at very low levels, as well as we see events happening at high levels, and that there is no, in fact, a discernible threshold, but you could say, beyond that point, you're perfectly safe. That does not exist in air pollution. Now, we do have some ambient quality standards across the world, in the United States and Europe and Mexico, and those are meant to say, what is the tolerable risk as a society that we're able to take to keep the engine running? Because obviously one of the results of air pollution is industry, right? And human movement. So if you had zero air pollution, there wouldn't be economy, for example. So you have to balance, having some of it. But so that you know is that there is no safe level in air pollution. And this study is actually a very interesting study, and it will illustrate a lot of these issues. So this is a study I wish I would have participated. So what the researchers did in London, is they took subjects and they said, I'm going to walk you for 2 hours, and we're going to go and stroll around and measure where you're breathing, and then at the end of it, you're going to hack up some sputum cells and get some lung function tests. But some of you are going to do it on Oxford Street, and some of you are going to do it on Hyde Park. It was actually a crossover randomized study. So the same subject walked and then waited several weeks and then did the other walk. All right? So they walked around here for 2.5 hours, and they walked around here 2.5 hours. Now, people always ask me, no, they were not allowed to go shopping. Right? They couldn't go in the stores. Somebody tried to go and sneak here on Fifth Avenue, on Saks Fifth Avenue, like they couldn't do it, because there's a lot of air conditioning and there's no particles, so you have to stay outside. So the results of this study, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, showed that, look at that, this is forced exhalation in 1 second, so that's how much your air can exhale a volume in 1 second in a forced maneuver. And this is the ones that walked on Hyde Park, and this is the one that walked on, this is after a few hours, man, on Oxford Street. So those who walk on Oxford Street within 2 hours of exposure had a 6 to 8% reduction on FEV1. Now you could say it's not a lot, but if you have lung disease, trust me, some of my patients would love to have a bit more. 8% is a lot. So, and people with mild asthma actually had steepest reductions, right? And people with mild asthma, this is healthy and asthmatics, people with more and mild asthma had increases on neutrophils in the sputum, and they also had increases on interleukin-8. So what's that telling you in this study is that even a short exposure to fine particles can lead to measurable changes in lung function and airway inflammation. Imagine if you were having to be exposed to that chronically every single day, right? Eventually it catches up and leads to functional impairment. This study we did a while ago with Albino Barraza and Isabel Romero, the group in Mexico City. And what we did is we had a large cohort of kids in Mexico City in an area that's called La Central de Abastos. Has anybody been there in Mexico City? No? La Central de Abastos is a place where all the fruit and all the produce from Mexico goes there. and they get dumped in, and then they sell it. But so it's very nutritious, right? It sounds very good, but the trucks taking the produce are unbelievable. They look like they're about to break anytime, right? They're just these clouds of smokes. So all these kids that live around there are constantly exposed to very high levels of elemental carbon and PM2.5. And elemental carbon is a component of PM2.5 that seems to have a lot of toxicity. And one of the things that we found in this study, this is for changes on biomarkers per interquartile increase of PM2.5. So we saw that a lot of these kids their airways had more acidity, they had reduced FEV1 and FEVC, and the more they stayed, so these effects were not, this is on the day of exposure, but these effects tend to accumulate with day 3, 4, and 5 of exposure. So there's some cumulative effect of PM2.5 on lung function. So these are all kids, and also with increasing nitric oxide, which is a marker of inflammation. A very interesting study of this sort was done in the 12 community studies in California. Rob McConnell and their group published this study a while ago, but here you can see this is the US, and they've had this study running in for a very long time, in which they follow kids in schools. Is it 12 communities or 13 communities? 12, Jane? 12. And how long has it been running? Since? 12 years. And it's led a lot of data to try to understand the effects of air pollution. And so one of the questions they had, the researchers in this study, is like, does it make any difference for asthma if you live close to a roadway, right? So if your house is centered smack in right there in the banqueta, or in the how do you call that? In the sidewalk, does that make a difference? Or where you live further away? So they had 2,000 kids, 2,000 females. Anyway, they had a mixed combination of these were adults, I believe, I apologize, different combination of ethnicities. And one of the things that they found, which is really interesting, is that look, you have 3 outcomes: lifetime asthma, prevalence asthma, and current wheeze. And these were all participants, and these were people that were long-term residents. So these are people that were at least there for, I think, greater than 5 years. So compared to those that lived 300 meters away from a major thoroughfare or intersection defined by road categories that Jane knows very well if you want to ask her, if you live within 75 meters of a major road, you have 46% increased risk of having lifetime asthma, 64% prevalence of asthma, and 67% chance of wheezing. So what does that mean? Kids with asthma that are constantly exposed to traffic in close proximity, where we see all these fine particles, have greater risk for having disease. And here you can see that on a graphic. This is the probability of prevalent asthma and these are people who just arrived. This is a group who just arrived in town, right? And this is the distance to road from 0 to 500. And look at that. This is a log and somewhat smooth with confidence intervals. And clearly you can see that if you're within 100 meters, you have a higher probability of doing asthma. And we've done other studies near the US-Mexico border where we show that if you have asthma and you live in a proximity to a border, you have a lot more airway inflammation, you have a lot more symptoms, and you have a loss of control as well. But if you just move there, it looks completely flat. So air pollution, you can't see this from there, I apologize. We published a review in the American Heart in circulation. The American Heart Association had an expert panel committee on particulate matter and cardiovascular disease. And we published this graphic there, and this one looks at all-cause mortality, cardiopulmonary disease, cardiovascular disease, ischemic heart disease. And all I want you to figure is that most of the dots, these are different studies, most of the dots are above 0, except for one over here. So telling you that cardiovascular diseases and particulate matter, the levels of implications are broad. PM2.5 has been, and PM10 to lower extent, have been implicated in heart failure exacerbation, ischemic heart disease, myocardial infarction, sudden death, and you name it. It's all over there. So it's a big, big risk factor for cardiac disease. Now, sometimes I get asked, so I get very excited because I think it's a very important topic, and frequently not, I get asked, well, smoking is much worse, is it not? And my answer is yes, but you choose to smoke. Here, everybody breathes this stuff. There are no choices here, right? While the percent increase in mortality is single digits, you're looking at 3 or 4% increase, you put that in millions population-wise, and suddenly it becomes a major, major, major event. This is the mortality increase in percent from this same paper, and this is the times for different studies, the 10 Euro studies. This is the American Cancer Society study, the 10 US studies over here, the NMAPS, Harvard 6 City studies, and all of them show that there's a cumulative increase in mortality with exposure, some more than others. Now, how do particles affect your body? And I'm not going to go, you probably are having a seizure just looking at this, but there are different pathways that are thought to involve what happens to you when a particle gets into your airways. So when you inhale one of these particles, it actually goes into your alveoli very effectively. The cells in there don't like it. They recognize it as foreign. And so your airway macrophages are just going to eat it. But they don't get hungry very fast. So basically this is what happens. They'll eat till they explode. They'll eat and explode, and they release, or they die, and they release a lot of substances. So there's this phenomenon we call spillover of lung inflammation to systemic circulation. And that includes oxidative stress. Particles also go into the bloodstream, causes changes in your endothelial function. We've shown that before. Your endothelial function is not working as well. They do affect production of inflammatory mediators through the liver, like IL-6, fibrinogen, and CRP, increased plasma viscosity. That leads to cardiovascular disease. There's a lot of effects on cardiac autonomic function. So some of these particles affect the fine-tuning of your heart. So it tends to be more of a slightly on a sympathetic drive than not. So that's supposed to be the relationship between air pollution and arrhythmia. Because mind you not, there are some studies, which I don't have here today, that show that in patients who have implantable cardiac defibrillators, so these are people with known bad heart disease who are increased for arrhythmia, and they go to a doctor and say, you need to have one of these pacemakers that can shock you if you go into an arrhythmia. Imagine having something on your chest that can shock you. So when particles up in the air, more of these devices fire away, just to give you an idea how powerful they are. 1 minute? Yeah. So a study by Annetta Peters in Germany shows that on your day that you have a myocardial infarction, you're exposed more to traffic by any means, particularly the first and second 2 hours are highly associated with the risk of myocardial infarction, the odds of almost 3. I'm going to skip this for a second and go over here. So if you clean the air, so this is perhaps the message. If you clean the air, if you use renewable energy, right? When I was in Atlanta, I was a resident in Atlanta in the 1996 Olympics. They used to tell us all the time, don't drive, it's going to be crazy, don't use your car, traffic would be horrible, and people bought into it. Nobody drove, everybody used the metro, the levels of pollutants went down, the levels of ozone went down, and guess what happens? So everything went down, particulate matter went down, ozone went down, nitrogen dioxide went down, so for the yellow areas represent the Olympics. Look at what happened. The number of kids coming to the emergency room for asthma dropped about 40%. 40%, right? Medicaid, these are Medicaid claims, so these are kids that are already poor, disadvantaged, 40% reduction because people drove their car less. Talk about a public message. So when it comes to air pollution, its impact on human health, nor air pollution exposures are the same. It matters who you are. People that are obese, have diabetes, are more susceptible to air pollution. We've shown that over and over again. Chronic and acute exposures lead to different outcomes, may involve different mechanistic pathways. There are no absolute safe levels. Reducing emissions certainly improves outcomes. And there are many important questions that remain. Who and whom can we protect, and by what means? And one of the things we've done that's going to be talked about is we've used omega-3 fatty acids as a way to intervene and protect individuals from particle air pollution. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. It was very informative. I just wonder if there's any dietary factor that could potentially, prevent the disease development by particulate matter.
Well, I think there are. I think there's obviously, this has been the matter of intense discussion these past few days, but I think there are ways to do it. Specifically, there are studies looking at omega-3 fatty acid supplementation. The data shows protection in some of the cardiovascular outcomes, both peripheral and cardiac. But there hasn't been, the study, for example, is there, so yes, for omega-3 fatty acids, but is there a study that shows that if you take it for years, in a populated city, will there be less deaths? That we don't know. Yes, because those studies will take a long, long, long time, a lot of people. So intermediately, yes, but not. Does that? You know, vitamins. There's a limited amount of studies. Vitamins D, C, E have been used in children with asthma, with showing improvements in control, reduction of symptoms here with ozone exposure. And those studies were done in Mexico City by my former mentor, Isabel Romeo. They've been replicated, and they show to be particularly useful in people who are GSTM1 null genotype, which happens in about 50% of the population.
Please. Yeah. Thank you for the interesting presentation. I like the walking subject study. When it was that, and did the study analyze the air composition in both sites, like in Hyde Park and Oxford?
Yes, very good questions. Yes, the air in Oxford had greater levels of particles than in Hyde Park, and that's in the paper. The paper was done 2008 in New England Journal of Medicine, I think. That was the date. But the paper goes extensively into the particle composition between both places. But I didn't show it because of time.
Please.
How much time do we need of free period away from the pollution to get away from the risk? You know, because we know that after quitting smoking, we stay in the risk for a long period. And recently, we knew that it's 15 years. How much time? You've talking about a recent study talking about 40% of the kids improved. I believe that was in a short period. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. The question is how much time do we do when exposed to if you move away to improve, right? Well, there are two papers done. One is in Mexico City and one is in California. That if you take people from a highly polluted environment and you put in a low polluted environment, they recover their lung function to some extent. In terms of geospatial ability, as long as you are not exposed within 50 to 100 meters, you are less likely to breathe this fine mixture of particles, and therefore are not as in danger. Do you agree, Jane?
Yeah, that's basically true. And I mean, in urban areas, there's no such thing as a place without particles. Sorry, there's really no such thing as a place left that has no pollution or no particles. You know, even in very remote areas of the globe now, we pick up particulate air pollution. Yeah. In the animal studies, we are able to watch recovery. After, for example, with embedded telemeters in the heart, we can watch what happens when an animal is exposed to very high levels of air pollution, and then how it decays over time once we take them out of that very high air pollution environment. So we do get some recovery, sort of short-term recovery overnight, but as soon as, you know, the animals or people are re-exposed, of course, they're right back up again. And it's hard to give you an exact answer on what that time is. It depends on the intensity of exposure. It depends on the chemical composition.
People have done very interesting. There's an article, again, not the time, but there's an article from that was published from China in their Olympic experience. During the Olympic experience, in asthmatics, peak flows are really low, and then, you know, no, before they're really low. During the Olympics, improve dramatically. After the Olympics, things go back to the same. They drop again. I mean, and there are examples for other markers. So it's also interesting. But there's sometimes no escaping. And indoors, by the way, indoor is good for ozone. So air conditioner, ozone levels inside 0. But particles.